good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's live webinar. I appreciate the fact that you've decided to join us for what should be a really interesting and timely topic, establishing a single source of truth for third-party risk specific to financial services. Now, in part, because of the regulatory requirements that apply in this space, and because of the intersection we're seeing today of processes, talent, and of course, AI, we have to talk about that in 2024, how we manage suppliers, how we address risk, and how we message that to the rest of the organization are critical topics for procurement to be aware of. Now, before I bring my two guests on screen today, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. If you've never attended an Art of Procurement event before, welcome to a completely live experience. You will not see any slides today. We do have some talking points we know we want to go through, but we do not have a script. And so that means you play an important role in today's conversation. If you're with us live and you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a nice wide chat panel. I will be keeping an eye on that as we go through today's conversation. Feel free to put in comments, put in questions for my two guests. I will pause as I see things come in, and I will allow you to have a voice in the conversation. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and get us started by bringing my two guests on stage. I'm joined today by Vivek Jayaraj from Deloitte and Arnaud Malardé from Ivalua.
Hello, good morning.
Hi, Arnaud. Hi, Vivek. How are you both?
Good, thanks.
Excellent. So let's get started by learning a little bit more about each of your backgrounds. Arnaud, typically we ask people about whether they chose procurement or procurement chose them. But given our focus on financial services today, I'm going to add in a little additional twist. So what led you to work in procurement with a focus on financial services?
So procurement chose me. I just came by procurement by chance. I was applying to consulting strategy firms at the time, and my resume went from one of these consulting firms to one of the former partners. He was a CPO at the time, and he convinced me to join his newly created procurement department. So that's how I started. And about FSI, it's also by joining Ivalua, I've been working with our customer base, our FSI customer base a lot, and learning a lot with them. And that's why I've been, just heading our solution for financial services within Ivalua. And maybe also because I have like a master's in market finance. So maybe this background in finance was very useful for me.
Just that little thing, that little master's degree in market finance. I'm sure that does come in very useful. Vivek, same question to you. How do you find yourself working in procurement with a particular focus in financial services?
Yeah, I've been with Deloitte for about 20 years now, and I really started my career in the technology space, specifically around technology procurement. So that's kind of where I got my, my initial foray into procurement. Given my technology background, Arnaud, I also have a master's in technology. And so there was kind of a natural fit there. And I found myself increasingly enjoying doing everything related to procurement. So I broadened beyond just technology, sourcing and procurement to categories, to broader procure-to-pay transformations, and working with CPOs on how they define their function. And so, a few years back, I sort of looked around and realized that for a lot of my background in technology procurement and services procurement, FSL was a natural home financial services, given that's their biggest spend category. It's a lot of a focus. And so I'm now the intersection leader for our sourcing procurement practice within financial services. So that leads me to work with banks, insurance companies, investment management firms, private equity firms, etc.
Now, Vivek, given that combination of companies and industries that you're working with, especially I know you mentioned insurance, I feel like when we talk about risk, it's not just about strategy, it's not just about preparedness. A lot of times it's just as much about mindset and psychology as it is anything else. How would you characterize the current mindset within financial services towards third-party risk?
Yeah, I think it's evolved significantly from being very much regulatory focused to now also increasingly a source of differentiation, a source of competitive edge. Firms are finding that the more they know about their suppliers, information about their suppliers, and being able to tie that all together from different sources, that actually helps them have a much better view into the extended supply chain, extended sources of risk that they were not having looking at earlier. So I definitely see kind of an evolution in where firms are thinking about cyber risk, or financial risk, to much more broader sets and domains of risk.
Now, it's interesting in there that you mentioned different types of risk. I am glad to hear that the mindset is not entirely averse to dealing with risk, right? That there's an opportunity to create competitive advantage. When we think about some of the types of risk that you mentioned, certainly there's supply disruption, there's brand risk, there's regulatory risk, but you also talked about cyber risk. Is there a hierarchy of concern among those types of risk, or is it simply, we have the very broad umbrella of risk, and then companies are doing what they can to prepare for and monitor risks within each of the categories?
So I'll let Arnaud chairman as well, but I don't see a specific hierarchy. I think that there is, obviously broad sort of sets of risk and risk domains. There's some prioritization depending on the nature of the firm and their business. But there's also emerging areas such as ESG that are now areas where companies are looking to see whether they have potential exposure risk profile that they need to be monitoring there. So there are some emerging areas as well.
Arnaud, I would be interested to get your perspective on this.
I agree with Vivek. I don't think there is a specific hierarchy. Although, from a certain financial institution to another one, you might find different weights depending on their own business, obviously, on certain side of the risk. But what I think is very interesting in financial services, it's this very concept and specific concept about third-party risk management. And it's different for me than as just supplier risk management. When a financial institution looks at risk, they look at the risk at relationship level, not just at the supplier level. And just let me take an example to show you how different it is. Imagine, for instance, you have two different banks. You have HSBC on one side and you have Bank of America. And they both work with the same supplier. Let's say it's an IT supplier. And let's say that Bank of America buys just cables and mouses, so very, commodities in IT. Yeah. But let's imagine that HSBC is buying the hosting service for the whole payment facilities of the bank. So both of them are working with the same supplier, which might have an inherent risk, which is really low because it's a sound supplier with very good financials. Yet they don't have the same risk at relationship level because they don't buy the same things. And HSBC in this case has a higher risk because they buy a very critical service. So to me, banks and all the financial institutions have understood how to look at risk in a very precise manner.
And it's interesting that you talk about managing that risk at the relationship level, Arnaud. I'd be curious specifically, again, within financial services, because I'm sure a lot of these organizations, even if they're not mandated to, which I know they are sometimes, have to have a chief risk officer, someone at the executive level that is responsible for overall risk. How does that change the profile of the individual or the team within procurement that is thinking with that risk mindset at the supplier relationship level? Are there risk professionals within procurement, or is it simply that category managers and relationship managers within procurement are acting under the guidance of overall risk in the company, but doing so based on those supplier relationships?
So usually, obviously, in all the major establishments, you have a compliance officer and team or a risk management team, and they obviously work closely with procurement. So procurement teams are, let's say, more educated to the risk management practices of the bank, which then might not be so in different sectors or industries, for instance.
Do you find that it also changes the team's approach to supplier relationship or performance management overall, given the high visibility of risk in financial services?
Well, definitely first they need, as we were saying, need to look at the risk at relationship level. They need to do in the way they do the process. They need to have like a sort of pre-risk assessment before even entering into a sourcing event, just to assess that the risk of the service that is the subject of this sourcing event is high or low, for instance. So the risk assessment is really the start of the process, which is not the case for other sectors so far.
Yeah. Now, Vivek, it's easy for us to talk about being effective when we think about third-party risk management. But if we want to be more precise about measuring and setting success goals around risk, how do you find that companies view and measure the relative success of their third-party risk management program?
Yeah, so every couple of years we run CPO surveys, and about 300-400 CPOs globally respond to that. And supplier risk third-party risk has increasingly come to the top of their agenda. And when we talk about how they see an effective program or their top strategies around that, it really starts with bigger or better supplier collaboration. So the effectiveness of the program is driven a lot by the right kind of supplier collaboration platforms that enable supplier collaboration. They're moving away from just pure questionnaire-based approaches to understanding in real time, from a multitude of sources, information and intelligence about a supplier that can help them, not just plan for different scenarios, but also improve their supplier relationships. And to the extent that they're able to do that, in an automated way, with automated workflows, etc., that makes it a much more effective and efficient program. So they're really looking at how do they get different sources of data at real time about a supplier and be able to action on that. And in fact, the more forward-thinking organizations are also using that to feed back into their category strategy. So you talked about procurement and the whole place. I mean, think about the category manager. If they have access to not just the risk profiles, but also the performance of the supplier, contractual performance, etc., how they develop their category strategies will actually be quite different.
It's notable to me that in what you just shared, you talk about sort of this balance of relationship and collaboration on the one hand, but then data and intelligence on the other. When we start to think about digitally enabling the third-party risk management process, very quickly brings us to this idea of having a designated single source of truth. Now, within manufacturing, we would typically think of that as being the ERP system. But in the context of financial services, what system most often ends up serving as that single source of truth?
So my perspective, and Arnaud, feel free against chime in here, we see within TPRM, there's almost a 3-tier sort of architecture for looking at a supply, right? And so the base level of the tier 1 for me is, your ERP system, as you mentioned, could be accounts payable data, the supplier data sitting in your ERP system. But then a tier above that, you start seeing, source to pay systems, right? You start seeing, either sourcing, contracting systems, etc., other sort of vendor performance management systems, supplier onboarding. So there's another level of supplier data that's present. And then, the tier 3 would then be specific, governance and risk systems, and in fact, even the integrated data feeds from third-party sources that you're looking at. So when you start thinking about that sort of a tiered level, then having very tight integration across all of that and being able to have a single view of the supplier across all of those systems and across all of those tiers becomes.
So Arnaud, I'm definitely interested to get your point of view on this idea of sources of truth, but also specifically if you want to comment on this idea of either multi-tier or integrated, right, systems, ecosystems, and how that relates to the company's ability to manage and monitor risk.
I think so. To go back to your first question, where does it sit in terms of tool? One thing which is important to take into account is what we said, risk is at relationship level, right? And so as a financial institution, if you want to look at risk, you need the relationship information. So what is the relationship information? It's your contracts. It's obviously the suppliers you do this contract with. It's the orders you have with them, the invoices you pay, etc., etc. All these pieces of information that make the relationship. And so obviously a good candidate to host all this information is your source to pay solution, any type of solution, for instance. But the second thing, which is very important is, and it comes back to having this one view, one source of truth, as Vivek was saying. If you want to have this single view, you need to have two things right. You need to have a single repository for suppliers and a single repository for contracts. Because if you have 2, 3, 5 supplier databases, how do you reconcile? How do you know if one supplier is a duplicate of the other one? How do you then calculate the overall risk of a single supplier? How do you calculate the overall spend with a single supplier? That's very difficult. And that's why, it was not only me saying it, it's funny because it was actually the CPO of one of the major banks in Europe that say that during an event, you need to have two repositories right and unique, the contract one and the supplier one.
And very specifically, I'm assuming even around contracts, I know for financial services institutions, the notion of direct spend versus indirect spend doesn't play out quite the same way that it would in more material-based industries. But making sure that all third-party contracts, no matter what they're for, are in that same system, even if it's potentially a little bit outside of what procurement would typically manage through the source-to-pay process, has to be part of that single source of truth, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. And you need to have, and these regulations, and we have new ones in Europe, just adding up onto what procurement needs to manage and what type of information they need to know. And if you don't have all of this connected with the rest of your processes and the rest of the information, then you're not really complying with regulation. If, for instance, you don't do performance assessment, or if you don't have exit strategies for very specific outsourcing agreements, and it's not connected to the right supplier, if you don't have an alternate supplier to this supplier, which is critical, well, you're not ready, one, to comply with regulation, and second, in case you have a risk occurrence, a problem, an issue with one of these suppliers, you're not ready to react.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things that there's been a great deal of interest and discussion around within procurement, and I know Ivalua has invested in this as well, is generative AI, not just for content creation, but also in terms of how it can be a part of things like third-party risk management. Arnaud, what are some of the things that you've seen discussed and in some cases actually put into practice to allow generative AI to help in this business process?
So generative AI is usually used to analyze a large amount of content and try to synthesize it, or to be able to have a lighter approach to a huge document, for instance. And a way, for instance, to apply it to third-party risk management is to ask a GenAI, let's say, model to give you some information in a summarized way about the risk of a certain category of spend, for instance, having it in the shape of a 5-Porter model, 5 Porter's forces.
Yep.
So you have a more digestible type of information for you to understand. Or we develop, for instance, on our platform, what we call the chat watch. So we have a chat within our platform where suppliers and stakeholders can chat over any item, whether it's contracts or invoices. And what this chat watch would do is actually screen all these chats and analyze where you have a potential fraudulent, let's say, intent, or you have issues. For instance, somebody asked for a change in the bank details. It's not a regular person asking for this. Maybe you should look into it. Mm-hmm. Or you've had repeatedly 3 times issues with the same suppliers. Maybe you should look into it. So trying to raise some awareness or some, let's say, information about some behaviors which are not the typical ones.
Vivek, maybe let me bring you on this to speak not just to what you've seen around generative AI, but also even overall AI more broadly. What have you sort of seen, discussed? What questions are you hearing asked around the ability to pull in AI on third-party risk management?
Yeah, so I think the foundational thing that, as folks are starting to get into this space, the foundational thing is, do they have the data, right? So number one, do they have the right quality of data? And that's frequently the biggest obstacle that's cited. With over 60% of procurement leaders will say, we'd love to do this, we just don't have the right data or the underlying infrastructure to be able to do that in order for, the Gen AI to actually, make sense. So that's one of the things they're grappling with. But we're seeing something at some of the more, the leaders in the space, we're seeing them start to deploy, use cases for Gen AI in risk. There's a company I know that's actually using it to start going through contracts and looking for sources of risk in that, existing contracts, negotiated contracts. They're able to do that a lot faster, obviously, but it also starts to, sort of generate risk reports. But then there's a human in the loop that can evaluate that and see whether certain, mitigating actions have to be taken. So they're starting to, as long as they have the repository, as long as they have, digitized and they have the ability now to start going through all of those contracts, we're starting to see people do some interesting things.
And it's interesting as you start talking about specific applications and use cases, given the need to stay compliant with regulations, as we've talked about, but certainly experiment with the opportunity of new technologies. Vivek, how are you seeing companies decide where to test, how to test, and how to learn from maybe some of these new capabilities, whether in a limited fashion or through some sort of pilot, so that they can learn and then ideally longer term roll something out that's a little bit bigger picture?
Yeah, usually we start with, with our clients, we go through a lab session, we start showing them the art of the possible, start exploring different use cases. And by the way, it's not limited to risk, right? We're starting to see
Sure
across the source to pay life cycle. So, we go through and look at different use cases, the relative sort of, feasibility for them and the benefit that they can get. And what's the underlying, tech stack that's required to enable that. And from there, it's a process of crawl, walk, and run. Right? You start small, and then you keep iterating, keep building on the success and prove the value.
Is there a conscious effort to look at places where additional risk could possibly be created? We talked about systems integration, right? Arnaud mentioned one SRM, one contract management system. Are teams specifically trying to find places where a previously unrecognized risk could be introduced into their systems and processes as they bring in AI, even just to test it?
Well, I think in AI, one source of risk is the misuse of it, especially if you don't know two things. Especially with Gen AI, if you don't know how to ask the right questions, you get the wrong answers. That's one thing, which is about team training. And second, it depends on let's say, the universe of data the tool has access to. And let me give you one example actually coming from FSI. It was an insurer in Europe. And we have this regulation called DORA in Europe. And so this insurer actually had a Gen AI tool internally available for the employees. And at the same time, DORA was also referring to their own insurance product they developed to a certain, let's say, audience and business, let's say, focus. And their Gen AI tool didn't have access to the overall internet, only to internal information. And so if employees would search for DORA through the Gen AI tool, they would think that DORA was only a homemade product by this insurer, whereas it's actually on the rest of the place on the internet, a major, let's say, financial services regulation. So in this very basic example, you see how the universe of data the tool has access to is very important, not to be biased to making one decision or another one.
And that is interesting because, certainly training and education are a part of it, but that's an area where even in the process of employees gaining valuable experience, there is a sense of risk. I feel quite confident that this European insurer has a statement someplace where you access the AI that says, we are only giving you responses based on internal information. Hopefully. And yet you're still trusting that human being to read that statement each time, remember the impact that it could potentially have on their results. This is an area where we want to reward experimentation, but I'm sure financial services firms have to be exceptionally careful about, even as you said, what can happen in the process of employees gaining that valuable experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as we start to wrap up the conversation, I'll sort of give one last offer. If anybody has here that has a question for either Vivek or Arnaud, please pop that in the chat and I will grab that before we wrap up. But as we sort of start to part, I'd be interested, we're at about the mid-year point on the year. We're just about to flip our calendars to July. Looking at the second half of the year, whether it's around trends in AI, specific third-party risk concerns that are impacting financial services, or even potentially pending regulation that people are focused on. Vivek, any parting advice or things that you would recommend that folks that are watching now, listening in, or with us later on demand should keep an eye on?
I think the universe of risks is expanding, right? So keeping an eye out on broader sets of risks and low risk domains, but doing so in a way that you're able to bring it all together and eliminating data silos, right? Like that's one of the biggest things we're seeing companies struggle with. And so doing some of that basic stuff that helps you layer on the more complex, complicated things that you're going to have to do. So I think getting some of the non-sexy stuff out of the way, right?
Yeah.
Data management is never a project that gets funded, but it's often necessary to then enable much more transformative approaches.
No, you're absolutely right. We can't do any of the fancy new emerging things if we don't have that quality source of consolidated data to go back and to pull from. Arnaud, same question to you. Second half of the year, as we go into it, what advice do you give? What things or trends should people be keeping an eye on?
I think, obviously, I agree with what Vivek said, so I would say something a bit different. But cybersecurity is a major concern, and the regulators have understood that. And this DORA regulation is very much about, all these technology agreements and analyzing that you are prepared as a financial institution, specifically against the risk of cybersecurity or of cybercrime in your technology, but specifically on the technology of your suppliers or the suppliers of your suppliers. And why so? Because, cybercrime and cyber criminals have understood that it's not by targeting the major banks that they will get a reward, because, everything is so secure nowadays. It's by targeting their supply chain. So maybe not their tier 1 suppliers like Microsoft, because they are very secure, but maybe the tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers, which are smaller and not so secure. And that's why they find a weak link. And that's where they actually get into the system. So that's why I think it's sound to look at this as procurement, all the more so because the regulators are also obliging them to do so with the regulation.
No, I think that's an excellent call out, because even though the vast majority of financial services spend managed by procurement is going to be indirect, there is still that supply chain there, and especially in areas like cybersecurity. If any data is exchanged right within that supply chain, there is the possibility for risk to exist. So that's an excellent thing to keep an eye on. So as we come to time, first of all, Vivek and Arnaud, I want to thank both of you for sharing your time and sharing your expertise. I would also like to thank everybody who joined us live. And of course, thank you if you found us later and you're watching on demand. I appreciate everybody making some time to be with us. I hope you have a great and risk-averse rest of your day. And we look forward to having you join us for future events and content.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.